A very warm welcome to everybody in this second workshop session we are organizing on the topic of achieving operational resilience. This is your facilitator, Manoj Kulwal from Risk Spotlight. So I will be running the workshop today. For those who don't know me, I just want to do a quick introduction before we dive into the content of the workshop. So I'm co-founder and chief risk officer at Risk Spotlight, where I've been for the last 7 years. And before that, I was the global product manager for a GRC product from a company called SAS. I am very passionate about utilizing risk management as a management tool. Where we can use risk management to define and execute good strategies. So I don't see risk management, purely as a regulatory or a compliance tool. So I see risk management as more a business tool or a management tool we can use to run better businesses. In terms of experience on the industry initiatives, I was part of the UK delegation when the revision of the ISO 31000 standard was happening. So that's where around 50 countries, experts from 50 countries generally come together and then decide what should be in the standard, what should not be in the standard. So I was very privileged to be part of the UK delegation in that global initiative. I was also a member of the IOR project team, so that's the Institute of Operational Risk, when they were creating and rolling out the certification called Certificate of Operational Risk Management. So that's a certification for anybody who needs to demonstrate that they understand the fundamental concepts of operational risk. Uh, then at Risk Spotlight, I've also designed a world's first forward-looking operational risk content service called Risk Spotlight Portal. So before around 4 years ago, when we looked around in the market, there were no content services on forward-looking content. So while there are many content providers like ORX and Auric and IBM and SAS who provide a loss database, there was nobody providing forward-looking content. And generally, when we want to do risk assessments or we want to build our scenarios, then you need forward-looking content. So yes, loss data is useful, but forward-looking content can make your risk assessments and scenarios a lot more realistic, a lot more complete. So that's where, when there was no solution available in the market, we decided to create that solution ourselves. And then we have over 100 financial services organizations now who utilize that for horizon scanning and for monitoring emerging operational risk topics. And training is my passion. So I run a lot of training courses. So through my classroom online training courses, I have trained over 1,000 operational risk professionals. If you're not already connected with me on LinkedIn, please do connect. I've given the link where you can go and send me a request, and it'll be great to connect and collaborate on any operational risk related topic. Before I dive into the new content, I just wanted to summarize. So we ran the first session last Thursday, and it was very glad to receive a lot of positive feedback after the workshop. So thank you very much if you provided that feedback. It's always helpful to get that sort of feedback. It sort of highlights that all the hard work is paying off in terms of helping actual practitioners out there. So the summary of what we covered in that workshop. So the first key thing we covered was that resilience is not something you can do, but it is outcome of making good quality business decisions and executing those decisions effectively. So you can't have a department called resilience because you can't do resilience. So resilience is an outcome of doing the right things, and the doing the right things in this context is making sure you're making good quality business decisions. And once those decisions have been made, you are executing those decisions effectively. And because that's a very critical topic, I'm going to touch on that in detail later in this session again. Then in the first session, we had talked about this concept of value creation and value protection. So typically every organization, you have a budget, and in every department, every business unit, the head of that department or business unit has to make the decision on how they're going to divide their budget. Are they going to divide it in value creation activities, or are they going to divide it in or allocate it to value protection activities? And how that balance is established determines whether a business unit is sowing the seeds for future problems, or they will be able to manage the future, irrespective of how that future unfolds. So looking at that focus on finding that balance between value creation, value protection is also very important from a resilience perspective. And we had covered a lot of details and examples in the first session. So if you missed that, then please do watch the recording of that to learn more about that very important topic. Then we had touched the concept that from a regulatory focus perspective, so what FCA and PRA have provided in UK on an operational resilience perspective, their focus is very much on business services. So we had touched on example of business service and how business service is different to the processes you may have, or the IT systems you may have, or the assets you may have. So that sort of is the new concept. A lot of organizations will need to get their head around to see, okay, how do we now look at the operations, look at our processes, but from a business service perspective. And we'll sort of course, look at more of that in today's session. And the last topic where we ended the session last week was on the granularity, because depending on how detail level you start defining your business processes, you may either end up with 6 to 10 services, or you may end up with 60 or 100 different business services. So that's where it's very important that when you start defining those services, you'll need to think about at what granularity do you want to define those services. And we have more details in that first session. So let's look at some of the new content for today's session. And then throughout the session, you can ask questions. So I'll keep an eye on the chat window. So if you do have any questions while we're covering the content, just ping your questions in the chat window. I will, keep an eye on that, and then I'll leave some time in the end also for Q&A. So let's start with a big picture, and then we'll drill down into the details. So before operational resilience came into the picture, these were some of the concepts we already had in the industry. So there's the concept of organizational resilience, where it's resilience at the entire organization level. But to achieve that, you need to have strategic resilience. So strategic resilience is where making sure that whatever business strategy your organization has set out on, that strategy is valid. And a good example of this is BlackBerry, for example, which was the market leader, but because they did not anticipate the changes which Apple introduced in terms of touch phone and iTunes Store and so on, the business became very irrelevant, or their strategy, sort of was no longer relevant to the new dynamics in the market. So there's a lot of content on strategic resilience. If you Google, it's a very, very common concept. But that's where you focus on the strategy and make sure that your strategy is valid and you don't go out of business because nobody now wants your products and services, or the market has changed so much that your strategy now is no longer relevant for the current market dynamics. Financial resilience, again, very common concept. So that's where you look at your liquidity risk, market risk, credit risk, and then regulators like PRA. That's where they focus on that to make sure that banks don't run out of capital, and that doesn't become the reason for a bank to go out of business. So those were two established terms. So what is new with the new regulation FCA PRA introduced in UK was this term operational resilience. And the real reason for introducing operational resilience was because the topics you need to implement operational resilience are very fragmented within an organization. So the way an operational risk team may be functioning is very different to the way a business continuity management team may be functioning. That may be very different to cyber risk and third-party risk and outsourcing risk. So organizations were doing operational resilience, but not in a consistent way. That it was a very fragmented approach, due to which it was very difficult to take some of those topics at the board and the strategy level, because those topics were then focusing very much on the granularity and on the detail. So that's sort of my interpretation of this new regulation, is where the regulator wants to provide a framework where organizations now try to bring some sort of harmony and integration across the various disciplines which have been implemented, and more importantly, bring those topics at the board and the senior executive level, so they don't ignore those topics just because it's a technical topic or it's too granular to deserve their attention. Yeah. So that's where sort of operational resilience is coming into the picture to tie in those aspects, but then make those aspects more visible and build more accountability at the board and the senior executive level. And these are some of the aspects. So one of the key things you want to do is make sure you don't start from scratch on operational resilience, right? Because you are already doing a lot of what is needed on an operational resilience perspective. Of course, there are some new aspects, but you're not starting from zero. So you already have a lot of what you need in place. And then on this diagram, I've just tried to highlight the areas that you may already have departments and teams looking after these different areas. But what they may have is they may have their own processes, they may have their own way in how they assess the risk, they may have their own different IT systems. And that's where that fragmentation has occurred, due to which then it becomes very difficult to look at the risks or look at the business from a strategic perspective, because the information you need is fragmented across these different disciplines. Yeah, so that sort of is one area where operational resilience will bring some harmony between these risk management processes. And then the two most relevant out of those are business continuity management and operational risk. So I wanted to just touch on those two topics because those are the ones which are directly relevant from the operational resilience perspective. So on business continuity management, so this is my take, right? So business continuity management is a very important function that can contribute to the achievement of operation resilience. So out of all the different departments we have highlighted on that right hand side, business continuity management is probably the most prepared or the most capable in terms of handling operational resilience. But in most firms, BCM is treated as a tactical function. So they're sort of put down into the organization hierarchy, and even though they may have lots of great ideas on how they can help the business, they don't necessarily get the attention they need in order to contribute to how the organization can be improved from a business strategy perspective. So they've sort of always pushed down at that tactical level, and they don't have that visibility at the board and senior executive level. And this is one of the things which Operation Resilience will do, is that it'll bring some of those BCM issues from tactical to strategic. So BCM is definitely going to become a lot more important in the operational resilience context within an organization. But that does not mean that BCM departments should change the name to Operational Resilience Department. Yeah, and which is what I have seen in some of the organizations where, when Operational Resilience came in, they just renamed the Business Continuity Department as Operational Resilience Department, or they created a new Operational Resilience Department and then moved the BCM team members into that department. And that may not be the right approach, because most BCM teams, they're already focusing on lots of priorities. They already have budget constraints. If they try to take on the activities related to operational resilience, then that may just stretch them too much if they're already stretched on resources at the moment. So while BCM is a very important function, it is a subset of the overall operational resilience requirement. So that rebranding is not going to help. We will need to think of operational resilience as something which brings everything together, and then BCM is one of those important components which need to be glued together for a resilience perspective. And Operation Resilience will ensure that business continuity topics now get due visibility at the board and senior executive level. So definitely now there will be a channel which will get created between the BCM team and the senior executive level, and that'll ensure that your business continuity topics are considered as part of those big strategic decisions when an organization may be, considering mergers and acquisitions, or they're thinking of changing the direction of the business, or they're defining the competitive strategy. Then they may not be looking at business continuity at the moment, but with operational resilience, it'll become important, and it'll become a necessary process as part of looking at those BCM topics in context of those strategic decisions. Yeah, so that sort of is my take. But of course, yeah, the industry sort of will evolve, and we'll see different practices emerge. On the operational, before we go to the operational risk, in the last session, there was this question on what is the difference between risk appetite and impact tolerances. So in operational resilience, or a regulator is expecting organizations to define impact tolerances. So there was that question on risk appetite and impact tolerance. And from a business continuity perspective, there's also this question on what is the difference between the recovery time objectives organizations may have set up as part of their business impact analysis, as part of the business continuity plan, and impact tolerances. So I wanted to just touch on those three differences. So it's very clear that how impact tolerance, which is a new concept in the operational resilience perspective, how is that different to the existing concepts you may have around risk appetite and recovery time objectives? So in terms of risk appetite, so let's look at one example. So this may be a statement you may have in your risk appetite state document, is the firm will provide 99.90% availability on all customer facing processes, systems, and services. So anything which is customer facing, you sort of define that boundary to say that, okay, that's the level of availability we are trying to achieve, because you cannot say that you have zero tolerance for any disruption, because that will be not practical. So you have to then leave some room for those disruption, and that's where sort of risk appetite then sets that boundary, that if we start having disruption to processes, system, and services where our availability falls under 99.90%, then we know our risk appetite has been breached. And typically, risk appetite, they're defined at a very high level. So they're definitely not defined at individual process level. They're not defined at the IT system level or at the service level. And in risk appetite, the focus is more on preventing the risk and protecting the firm. So it's more about protecting the firm, that certain risks which the firm may have to deal with on the journey to achieve its objectives, how the firm can protect itself from those particular risks. So the focus on risk appetite is definitely on prevention, and it's more about the firm rather than the external stakeholders. Then recovery time objective, which comes from BCM. So an example of recovery time objective would be that you have an objective for your online banking system is 60 minutes. That if your online banking system is down, then you want to have enough recovery controls that your system is then back and recovered within 60 minutes. And this is expressed in time, as the name says, the recovery time objective. And recovery time objectives are defined at a very granular level. So that's one difference between your appetite and recovery time objective. Risk appetite is generally very high level. Recovery time objectives, you may define that at specific processes or on specific IT systems or at a specific asset level. And the focus on recovery time objective is more on recovering as quickly as practically possible. So you're sort of trying to look at your best case scenario. You're not looking at your worst case scenario when you're defining your recovery time objective. So you're saying that, okay, depending on what typically happens in our business environment and based on the resources we have, what is the time duration which we want to set for ourselves, so that if our systems go down, our processes go down, then we are able to recover those systems and processes within that threshold we have defined. And recovery time objective does try to balance the consideration between the firm and the external stakeholders. So while risk appetite is more about the firm, recovery time objective is also looking at the customers to say how many customers may get impacted, or how long the customer may not be able to log into your online banking system. So you do look at both of those perspectives. Then let's look at the impact tolerance. So an example of impact tolerance could be that impact tolerance for processing any overdue direct debit payment is 24 hours. So if there are direct debit payments set up by customers on their bank accounts, and if something is wrong with your system and you're not able to process those direct debits on time, then you're saying that we will at least process those within 24 hours of where they are due, because you were not able to process them on time. So now you're setting a tolerance to say within 24 hours you'll process all of those. So impact tolerance can be expressed in time, but it can be expressed in other units also. So it doesn't have to be time. So that's one difference between recovery time objective and impact tolerance. The recovery time objective is always time based, but impact tolerance can be time and other unit of measurement. And an example of that is, let's say, number of incoming calls into your customer call center. If they exceed 125% of the call handling capacity, then that is what you would set at your tolerance. So that means a lot of customers are trying to call, but they're not able to get through because you've sort of exceeded your capacity. And in this case, you've exceeded the capacity by 125%. And then from the regulatory perspective, the requirement is to define the impact tolerance at the service level. So while your recovery time objectives may be defined at the process level, they may be defined at the IT system level, they may be defined at asset level, impact tolerances, the requirement is to define those at the business service level and not at the process level or not at the IT system level. The focus is more on defining the maximum disruption level beyond which the disruption will result in intolerable harm to consumers and market integrity. So that's where you're looking at severe but plausible worst case scenario. So the sort of situations you're thinking about when you're setting your impact tolerance are way beyond the sort of situations you're thinking about when you're setting your recovery time objective, because you're not necessarily thinking of all the worst case scenarios when you are defining your recovery time objective. And it's very possible that when a event happens and you breach your impact tolerance, you have also breached your recovery time objective, because impact tolerance then is going beyond where you may have set your recovery time objectives. So that's where it's always reflecting extreme and exceptional circumstances, situations, or crisis. So a big cyber war by nation state, for example, would be a scenario you would consider when you're setting your impact tolerance, but you may not consider that scenario when you are setting up your recovery time objective, for example. And in context of setting up impact tolerance, you're always thinking about your external stakeholder. So the firm is not that relevant in setting your impact tolerance. So it's more about the external stakeholders. So it's about your customers, or it's about other organizations, maybe which may be relying on your services to execute their activities or provide their particular services. Okay, so let me just pause there. I see there are some questions. So let me see if we can bring that here. Yeah, so the comment from Mike is that, yeah, I think RPO should also be reflected as resilience may be impacted more if there is a data loss. Yeah, so absolutely. So we're not saying that, yeah, RPA is completely irrelevant, definitely relevant in the context of operational resilience. Okay, but what impact tolerance is trying to do is it's trying to just stretch your scenarios or the situations you're thinking about a little bit more extreme, so that you also then can set some tolerance on those in those extreme circumstances. Okay, so that sort of is how I see as the difference between those three concepts. Then bringing this from an operational risk perspective. So one of the things where operational risk teams may need to adjust what they do from a resilience perspective is to just think about the granularity of the risk. So let me explain what I mean by that. So in this case, on the left-hand side is where I'm showing at different level where you may look at technology risk. So you may have a level one where you just think of technology risk as a broad category, or a subset of technology risk is technology failure, or and the subset of that is IT system disruption. A subset of IT system disruption is disruption to customer facing IT systems. So you make a separation between customer facing and non-customer facing. Or you can define your risk at disruption to online banking IT system, which is now, if you have 800 different customer facing system, now you're defining the risk just for the online banking system, which is one of those 800 different systems. Or you can go a little bit more granular to say disruption to online banking IT system due to cyber attack, where you bring a primary causal chain when you define your risk. Yeah, and again, there is no right or wrong here, right? Because so depending on what you're trying to do, sometimes higher level is better, sometimes granular level is better. So I've just highlighted, sort of the pros and cons you want to consider on the right-hand side. So if you sort of define your operational risks at a higher level, then of course, yeah, you're going to have fewer risks. They will be very high level, and it'll be very difficult for you to assign ownership. So like technology failure, I mean, how do you assign ownership to that risk? Except that, yeah, you assign maybe head of IT as the owner of that risk. So it's very difficult to assign ownership on technology failure risk, but it'll be very easy for you to assign risk owner if your risks were granular, like disruption to online banking IT system or disruption to online banking IT system due to cyber attack, because then that risk is a lot more close to real life risk. And then there are real people, sort of managing that risk. So you can then identify the appropriate owner from those individuals who are involved in that risk. But if you have very high level risk, then you can, then only assign somebody higher up in the organization as a risk owner. But then, yeah, you end up into all sort of issues because they're not actually managing that risk from a day-to-day perspective. Then the first line also, yeah, finds this very difficult if the risks are high level. So at a Swiss bank, when we were involved in a project, the head of IT, so he used to manage 8 different IT systems, and he used to get an operational risk RCSA where he had to provide one likelihood and financial reputational impact for IT system disruption risk. And he was like, okay, which one which likelihood of which system? I manage 8 system. I don't know, what should I put from a likelihood perspective? What should I put from a financial impact perspective? So first line then finds it very difficult to assess the risk and analyze those risks if those risks are at a very high level. But if you make it granular, then it becomes much easier for them to do their risk assessments. Becomes much easier for them to manage the risk on the day-to-day basis, because the granular risks are what they're managing on the day-to-day basis. But the higher level risk, so the reason most second line operas team, they've done it because it's easy for them, because they can then easily aggregate those risks. It's easy for them to produce the report, for the board and the senior executives. So that's the upside of having that higher level risk. But then the downside is then the first line is where you then get conflict from the first line when you go and want them to assess those higher level risks. And it'll be very difficult to understand or manage operational resilience at the higher level, because in operational resilience, we're going down to individual service level. So you will need to define your operational risks at a granular level if you want to use your operational risk register from an operational resilience perspective. So if your operational risk register is at a very high level, then from an operational resilience perspective, you'll have to create another risk register, and that'll be sort of a big waste of effort, a lot of duplication, and I definitely would sort of recommend against that. Yeah. So this is one of the things then operational risk teams need to look at. If their operational risks right now are at a very high level, then they may have to start defining some of those risks at a little bit more granular level, so that those risks can then be assessed as part of the operational resilience initiative. And this is sort of, I wanted to highlight this example because this is a common problem, and a lot of organizations, they define operational risk at a very generic level. So I wanted to share an example of the TSB system disruption event, which happened in April, where they were trying to migrate the core banking system, and then everything went wrong, and customers were not able to get into the system for about 8 to 12 weeks. And that was one of the big events which started this whole discussion around operational resilience in UK. And the analysis of that by Slaughter and May, which looked at what went wrong, they highlighted that defining those risks, that those risks were very generic in terms of how TSB was managing those risks. The level at which they had to define those risks were very generic. So there were risks like management stretch, cost increases, which are sort of so high level that, I mean, how do you manage this? How do you assign an owner to that risk? How do you define control if the risks are defined at that such a high level? And I have an example of the risk register. So this is what the risk register of that program of upgrading the core banking system looked like. So you can look at the names of the risks. So customer, was a risk, fraud, and cost increases. So definitely you don't want, if you have your risks defined at that level, they will not be very useful from a resilience perspective, because resilience, you need to go a lot more granular than the risks which are defined here at the high level. Okay, so then let's drill down then into the details. So last week I had highlighted the set of activities of what organizations need to do in terms of getting preparing for the operational resilience related regulations in UK, and that I'm sure other regulators in Europe and around the world will soon follow. So while this is a UK issue right now, we know that regulators in other parts are also actively looking at this. And with COVID-19, resilience is going to become sort of the next big buzzword around the world, not only in financial services but also outside financial services. So I'm not going to sort of read out each of these because we had covered this last week. So what I want to touch on is just show you some practical examples of how that once you've defined your business services, how would you go and map those business services to your business components, such as your business processes, your assets, and products. And then I want to give you an example of how you can develop your methodology in terms of assessing your resilience. So how can you define the impact tolerances? How can you define different scenarios to assess the resilience? And then we'll also sort of look at the impact tolerance in a little bit more detail. So I'll touch on those three topics. But instead of slides and sort of theoretical concepts, I'll show you some practical examples of how you can do that. So let me just log into our software, which I had highlighted, which is where we sort of developed all the concepts around operational resilience. So in this case, let me use an example where I will go into view business services. So this is where all the business services are documented. So let me open the one where I have prepared the content for this particular session. So in this case, this particular service is RWS Online Banking Service, which is used by this fictitious bank we have called RWS Bank, which is used by the retail customers. So they've defined that, okay, what is that service used for? So customers can open new accounts, they can check their balances, make payments, direct debits, and so on. So we talked about all of that. So let me cover then some of the new concepts we want to look at the session today. So in this case, we've analyzed the peak time, we've analyzed the service volumes, and then we've defined the impact tolerance and resilience assessment, which I'll come to. So first, let's look at the mapping. So once you've defined your service, then the operational resilience regulation is saying that you need to map those services to the different components of your business. So let me click on the business management tab. So this is where you can see the level of mappings you may want to do. And then again, depending on how much complex your business is, how big your organization is, these mappings then can be very simple. Or if you are a very global organization, if you have lots of operations, back office, middle office, front office in different countries, then this can be a little bit more complex for your organization. So the first thing we've highlighted here is mapping to the objective. So if that service was to go down, then what is the impact on the business? So in this case, we've said that, okay, these are the two objectives we have as a business, where we want to maintain an online availability of our online banking system at 99.95%. So if the service was down, then that objective would get impacted directly. Plus, we have a business objective where we want to keep our customer churn under 8% in 2020. So customer churn is what percentage of your customers you may lose during the year, and we want to keep that under 8%. And of course, if this service was not operating, if this online banking service had a lot of disruption during the year and we were not managing it effectively, then customers would get frustrated. They would leave us and go to another bank. So that will increase that level of customer churn. So this is what we like to do, that we like to connect everything to what the business is trying to do, because the board and the senior executives, they may not be so much interested in the resilience aspect, but they are definitely interested in the business objectives. So as soon as you connect anything we do in risk and resilience to the business objective, suddenly we start talking the language of the business rather than talking the language of risk or business continuity. Yeah. So that sort of is one important connection. Then you may want to connect this to your business processes to say which business processes is where that service is currently used. So if that service was down, then these are the different business processes which you may not be able to operate if that service was down. Then you can list all the different products which are available, and then in real life, yeah, that'll be a much bigger list. But I've just highlighted, yeah, the sort of products which then customers use or customers can buy using this particular online banking service. Then you have the asset aspect. So this is where you asset can either be tangible or intangible asset. So in this case, I have mapped it to the IT data center. So that's where then the IT system, which is used in the background by this service, that physical server is sitting at some data center. The people who are managing the IT system on which this service is based, that's where they work. So we've identified that particular asset, because if there was, let's say, a terrorist attack or a natural disaster which impacts that data center, then that can impact the availability of this particular service we're looking at. So that's where you create that connection, that what are the assets this particular service is dependent on. So it can be a tangible asset like a building, which in the operational resilience consultation document has been referred to as facilities. So that's what that is a term used in the regulatory documents. And then the core banking system is also then a very important asset, because that system, then the software, the hardware, which is used to run that system, is then also a very important asset. So if there was a cyber attack on that IT system, then that will impact the availability of the online banking service to the customer. So that's another asset we have mapped in this case. And again, you in real life, you will have a much bigger list in terms of which assets may be connected to your services. Then another element the regulation talks around is the third parties. So can, uh, which third parties, yeah, can impact the availability of the service. So in this case, we've identified Accenture, we've identified Datamark, which is used for call center, and then in this case, the bank has a center in Krakow, Poland. So that has been highlighted as a third party from an intra-group perspective. So it's within the firm, but it's still considered as a third party. Because it's providing the services which the bank would have otherwise done in the UK. And then you have SAP, which is in this case is providing the software for the core banking application. So that then gives you the connection with the third party. So when you were doing your third party risk assessments, and if there was an issue you were starting to have with one of these third parties, then you will be able to immediately see which services now may get impacted if due to those issues you're facing with the third party. Or if you were thinking of switching your third parties, if you want to change your core banking system from SAP to Oracle, then you can look at all the different services which are connected with SAP, so that you can consider that as part of that transition plan. So that sort of is where the third party connection comes in. Then you have your stakeholders. So this is where then you identify any individuals or organizations who then either can influence what is done with this particular service, or can be influenced based on the availability of this service. So in this case, if we have a core banking IT development team, which is the team which is then making the changes to the online banking software, then they become an important stakeholder in context of the service. Then I've added the regulator as an important stakeholder, and then the different customers you have in the different countries who are utilizing this service. So we've also highlighted them as a stakeholder. And this then also allows you, so in the background, you want to think of this as a three-dimensional sort of cube, where you can look at any side of the cube and you're able to then see all the connections, assuming that, yeah, you've made those connections. Then in the regulation, there's also discussion around talking about the constraints, or capturing the constraints and vulnerabilities around the service, because that's where then you find out what sort of problems can happen with that service. And then you need to demonstrate that you've identified those, and then you have some actions or remediation actions in place to address those. So in this case, the constraint, we have defined it that there are only 6 IT team members who fully understand the IT system utilized by the service. So it's sort of a dependency on a very small group, that if they were to sort of leave the bank, then there may be issues in terms of when we're making changes, we may not know what changes we're making, and that may result in disruption to this particular service. Then on the constraint, this service can only handle 2 million concurrent customers. So that's another, that if that constraint is breached, so if the bank is very successful, and then if you have more than 2 million customers who then log in at the same time, then then your service may get disrupted, because the capacity you have in terms of your infrastructure in the background, it can only handle 2 million concurrent customer. So that becomes then a constraint you need to document and you need to manage. And then when you're making decisions to grow your business, you want to look at those constraints, that if we launch a few good products and those products are really successful and we get a lot of great customers, you want to watch out for those constraints, that you may want to then increase those constraints so that your IT infrastructure will be able to handle the additional customers you'll get with your successful products. And then another constraint we have here is that the IT system is utilized. The IT system which we use is 22 years old. And because it's a very old IT system, it's very difficult to manage and upgrade at the moment. So that becomes then a constraint the business has been living with. And because it's a very old system, it may be difficult to manage, or you may be making the changes and some changes may not be made properly, and then it goes down, or it may go down on a regular basis just because of having old infrastructure. In terms of vulnerability, you have services accessible to customers via the internet. So that becomes a vulnerability, because anything which is accessible over the internet to our customers is also then potentially exposed to cyber criminals and malicious actors. So it's just a vulnerability then you want to document around that particular service. And then, of course, you will identify the relevant cyber risks and controls and manage those risks. But you have to identify what are the vulnerabilities where you are aware of those vulnerabilities. And in this case, you also highlight that there are two vendors who have administrative access on the IT system, which is utilized by the service. So it's not only your internal IT team, but there are two vendors who have administrative privilege. So whoever the employees of those vendors, if they wanted to go malicious one day, they may be able to use their admin access to either bring the system down, steal the data, or do any malicious activity. So that's one of the vulnerabilities then you need to be aware of in context of this service. And then, of course, you want to have the risks and controls in place to make sure that vulnerability is not exploited. Then other elements you can have is your business decision. So in this case, because the IT infrastructure is very old, so in this case, the bank has decided to upgrade their core banking system. So in this example, we're calling it as the Omega IT system. So any business decisions which have been made which affect this particular service can also be documented and mapped to the service. So then you always have a history of which business decisions we've taken which may have impacted the resilience of that particular service. And I'll come back and revisit the business decision aspect a bit later. And then if there are any policies, so in this case, I've just mapped the information security policy, that policy is then relevant in context of that service. So we've done that mapping. And then the last two elements we have here is the business environment. So this is where you look at your internal and external factors which may affect this particular service. So in this case, I've just documented like government lockdowns, for example, which may restrict the people who are able to go and effectively operate the IT systems on which this service relies on. And then you may have another trend in this case is that more customers are gradually shifting from using online banking to mobile banking. So in this case, we're talking about the online banking service. But if the bank has noticed a trend that, okay, over time, more customers are switching to mobile banking, then that may become the more important service than the online banking service. So as a trend, you are keeping an eye on that because it relates to this particular service we are talking about. And then there has also been a significant increase in cybercrime activity to take advantage of uncertainties. And which may then affect the availability of this particular service if the cyber criminals go after our online banking IT system. So those would just be factors which may be internal to your organization or external to your organization, so that you can keep an eye on those aspects and make sure that whenever you are making any changes to your service, you consider those factors. And the last one is what we call as the business situation. So this is where if you are thinking of doing something and you want to just do some risk analysis on that situation. So in this case, the bank was considering whether they want to move the data center from London to Krakow. So as part of that thinking, they have done some analysis, and that's what the business situation then has the details of what analysis were done. And then depending on the analysis, they can decide whether they want to do it or not do it. But that sort of is what we call as the business situation. So you can look at the different thinking or the different type of analysis which may have been done in context of that crisis. So that sort of is what we're talking about, mapping from a business perspective. And all of these are business topics in terms of that you have these processes, you have these assets, you have these third-party relationship. What we're trying to do now is map those to the services so that now you will be able to do that what if analysis. So, okay, what if this third party was to go bankrupt? What impact does it have? Or what if there was a terrorist attack on that data center? And then which services may get impacted, that you can then do that sort of what if analysis once you have those connections established. Then you, from a risk management perspective, you also want to then connect the services to your risk register, your control register. So in this case, we are connecting it to the risk appetite statement. So that particular service now relates to the risk appetite statement, where we want to provide a 99.95% availability on all our customer-facing digital retail banking services. So you can then see the connection between that service and the risk appetite. And then you bring out all the operational risks. So in this case, if there are already operational risks which you have captured, and if they're granular enough that they can be mapped to that particular service, then you can map those operational risks to your service very easily. And then through that connection, you will then also get a visibility on what are all the different controls you have in place for managing those risks. And then you can do a assessment of the control environment, but in context of this service. So that's what the ability is, to look at the control environment. So if you have 50 controls related to the risks for a particular service, then you can analyze those 50 controls as a collection. So that allows you to then bring that mapping into all the information you will have in your risk world from a risk perspective. Then in the failure and issues is where in the operational risk register, if you're capturing issues and if you're capturing operational risk incidents, then you will be able to also connect those into your services library. So in this case, if we're starting to see that on Mondays between 7 a.m. and 11 a.m., we're getting a lot of complaints from customers that the service is really slow. So then that has been flagged as an issue, and then somebody is investigating that, and we need to go and fix that. So that has been flagged as an issue. But then where those services have gone down, so like on 2nd November, the service was down for 12 minutes. On 18th February, the service was down for 24 minutes. Then you can also capture those. So that will then show you from a resilience perspective, are we doing a good job or are we not doing a good job? Because if there are lots of incidents happening, then something is not right from the resilience perspective. So that, and again, you already should be capturing those in your operational risk register. So it's just bringing that and connecting it to the appropriate services is what we're doing here. So none of that information we are looking at here is new. So the only new information you're capturing is the set of services you need and the mapping you need to do with the data you may already be capturing. Then from an action perspective is where you can capture any action. So in this case, if you've identified that on Monday the performance is slow because we are reaching our capacity of our server, then somebody's taken an action to increase that capacity by 20%. So then you have visibility of any actions which are currently being taken, which may affect that particular service. And also the strategic program which the bank has taken in terms of upgrading their core banking software. That program is also mapped here. That project is also mapped here because, of course, that program is going to have a very direct impact on the availability of the service. And then you also bring the compliance angles to see if there are any regulations which may be connected to this particular service. So of course the operational resilience regulation, which has been thought about in UK, would be connected to that. But you can have UK data protection, you can have GDPR, you can have PSD2. So there may be lots of different regulations which may be related to that particular service. And if your compliance team also wants to then see that angle where they can see, okay, which regulation impact which critical business services, then if you have this connection, then you will be able to you'll be able to do that mapping. So that sort of is the first aspect I wanted to show in terms of mapping. And this should be a one-time activity, because this is not something you have to do on a regular basis. So this is where some organizations have already started this work, where they've identified the services and they're starting to do the mapping. But once that mapping is done, then over time, it'll just be a maintenance effort. So it may look like a lot of work initially, which, of course, it is. But that's why you need the additional investment and the resources to be able to do that one-time work upfront. So once that mapping is done and you have visibility on all the different dependencies on your service, then what you need to do is you need to set your impact tolerance for that particular service. So let's look at that aspect. So if I open the impact tolerance screen here, so this is where we have defined the impact tolerance. In this case, so the unit of measurement we picked is hours, but of course you can have other units of measurement depending on which service you were looking at. So in this case, we've decided to use hours, and then in the regulation, the regulator talks about that for the dual regulated firm who are regulated both by FCA and PRA, they have to think of two impact tolerances. So the first impact tolerance is where the consumers may get impacted. So that's where it would be of interest from an FCA perspective. And the second impact tolerance is where there can be a systemic impact that the disruption of that service can create instability in the financial system, or it can make the viability of the firm itself at risk. So the bank itself may face severe financial constraints and may even go bankrupt. So that's where PRA then would be interested if that second tolerance is breached. So that sort of is what we've used in this example, but instead of using the PRA and FCA, because that's very specific to UK, in other countries, there may be other regulators. So we don't, you don't want to make this specific, because so we had to define two terms. So we've just defined two terms: as severity 1, which is sort of that first impact tolerance where consumers or a large amount of consumers would get impacted if our service was down beyond 48 hours. So that's what we've set up here. The impact tolerance is 48 hours. But of course, your recovery time objective will be a lot smaller. In this case, you won't have 48 hours, because in this case, we're thinking of some extreme circumstances. And that's where we're saying that in those extreme circumstances, if the service was down for more than 48 hours, then that's where it can cause significant impact to our customers. And then severity 2 is where we've set it to 72 hours. So you're saying that if our service then was down for 3 days, then it can start having significant impact on not only our organization, but also to other organizations. Because then if we have a lot of payments which are processed between our banks and other banks, and if those payments were not processing, then it can create instability in the financial market and for other financial services organization. So that sort of is where we're calling it as severity 2. So you define your two impact tolerances. Okay, so that's just sort of the approach we are recommending. But of course, different organizations are going to try different ideas, and we'll see sort of which approach becomes common. But we at least the thinking we've done, we wanted to put something simple, because you don't want this to be too complicated. So you want it to be simple, and then you wanted to make sure that it covers all the key elements, and then you can easily do reporting on this and escalate and share it with the board, the risk committee, and the senior executives. So that sort of is our recommendation on how to think about impact tolerances. But of course, to define those impact tolerances, you need to do all that hard work we've done in the background of getting your services, mapping those, identifying the vulnerabilities, identifying the risks, looking at your risk appetite, seeing whether your risk exposures are heading in the right direction or wrong direction. So you'll need all that data in order to be able to define what impact tolerance you are defining for your organization. And then, of course, the regulators can come and challenge that. So if they think 48 hours is too long, they may want you to then reduce that to 36 hours or 32 hours. And then as an organization, you will need to then prioritize your resource allocation and see what can be done to reduce those impact tolerances if the regulator thinks that's not right compared to what they're seeing with other firms within the industry. Okay, so let me just look at the questions to see if there are any questions here. So there's a question from Nirmala in terms of, should we also capture near misses around the services? Absolutely, yeah. So whenever I talk about incidents, I include the incidents and near misses. So definitely, if there was a near miss in relation to the disruption to that service, then you would definitely do that. And then Nirmala had a question around risk appetite. For me, is the risk a firm is willing to take in pursuit of its strategy. The tolerance limit is set at an upper and lower limit within the risk appetite level. And if anything falls outside the range, action is required to ensure the right amount of risk is taken. Yeah, absolutely, Nirmala. So completely agree with that. Yeah. So in some cases, upper or lower limit may not make sense, like what we had defined, the 99.95% availability. But you could say that, okay, it's between 99 and 99.95% availability. So you could have defined your appetite if you in a range like that. Okay, but absolutely agree, Nimla, with what you said on the appetite. So that sort of is in terms of impact tolerance. So and then the regulator is saying that, you need to review that at least once a year, make sure that you are able to then manage your business and stay within those impact tolerances. So if a big incident happens and you're not, those impact tolerances are breached, then something is not right. Either your impact tolerances were too narrow, or you did not factor in the right type of scenarios when you were assessing, when you were defining your impact tolerance. So once the tolerance is defined, then the next thing you need to do is you need to assess, okay, how effective are we from a resilience perspective on that particular service? So if you have 60 or 70 different business services, then you want to be able to produce a report to the board to say that, okay, we are doing well in terms of resilience on these 55 services, and we have some issues in terms of resilience on these 5 services. So you need some way to assess your services so that you are able to identify which services then require escalation or more remediation action. So that's where sort of we're recommending a concept of resilience assessment, where we are again using the severity 1 and the severity 2 aspect. So the first aspect we're saying is from a resilience perspective, you also want to focus on the prevention aspect. So while the regulator in UK is saying that from an operational resilience perspective, you should only focus on, you should assume the event has happened, and the focus is more on how do you recover from the event, but we don't want to be constrained by just what the regulator says, right? So we want to use the best practices from the resilience discipline, and the best practice from the resilience discipline also talks about making sure that you don't have those disruptions in the first place. So if you're assessing resilience, then you also need to assess that based on the current controls you have in place, what level of availability can you provide on this particular service? So in this case, we're just defining 4 levels. So you can say that, you can provide more than 99% availability on this particular service. Then that will sort of classify as that, you are very resilient. If you can only provide 95% to 99% availability, then you'll go level 2, or between 90 and 95% availability. And if it is, you can only provide less than 90% availability, then that is not very good from a resilience perspective, especially if you're talking about important services used by external stakeholders like customers. Okay, so this is again just our recommendation. Yes, this is not from the regulation. So this is our recommendation on what we could do to assess our services once we've defined them, and once we have defined the operational resilience. And then you can say from a severity one perspective. So severity one is that first level where the consumers would be harmed, but the viability of the firm and there is no impact on the the stability of the financial markets. So this is on the severity one. How confident you are that you will be able to recover your service within the tolerance you have defined. And then you can see the tolerance at the bottom. So from a severity perspective, if we say that level one, where we are saying that we are 99% confidence that we will be able to recover this service if it goes down within 48 hours, which is the tolerance we have defined. Yeah, and then level two is 95% confidence, level three is 90%, and level four is below 90% confidence. So that's where, so in this case, yeah, we're saying 99% confidence. And then you are doing an assessment for severity two, which is your 72 hours. So that's where if the disruption goes on for more than 72 hours, then now the stability of the financial market can get impacted, or the viability of the firm itself, could be under question. So again, you are then defining to say, okay, how confident you are that you will be able to recover your service within the defined severity 2 tolerance, which in this case is 72 hours. Yeah, and then of course you'll need to support why you are confident, and board and the risk committees will challenge on why you think you're 99% confident. So there's a lot of evidence you will need to produce, and that's where if you have your risks and controls and all that connected, then it'll become much easier for you to produce that evidence. But if you have fragmented system where your third party system is in one place, your op risk is another system, your BCM is another system, then it'll become very difficult for you to bring all that together to be able to support why you have assessed that service in a certain way. Okay, so that's our recommendation, and that sort of is what you can then do once a year on that service. You can do once a quarter, or you can do whenever something changes on that particular service. So you can do those resilience assessments as frequently as possible for each of your individual services. So then the next thing the regulation talks about is scenarios. So when you are defining those impact tolerance, you need to develop some scenarios, and then you also need to use scenarios to test in which scenarios you will be able to stay within impact tolerance, and in which scenarios you will not be able to stay within those impact tolerances. And then you'll have to produce all that evidence to your board and your risk committee and to the regulator, so that they can see that the right thinking has been done in terms of setting those impact tolerances. So that sort of is where I can share sort of what would be our recommendation in terms of how you look at those scenarios. So in this case, we've created two scenarios. So there's the large scale cyber attack on our online banking system would be one example, or a significant disruption may happen to the online banking service after we make a major system upgrade. Like what happened with the TSP bank when they were doing the upgrade. So let's look at one of the scenarios, the cyber attack scenarios. If I open that scenario. So in this case, the concept we use to develop scenarios is you want to think about what are the different drivers which will drive the severity of this scenario. So that's what we've identified first. So if we have, for example, 2 or 3 large-scale cyber attacks within 24 and 48 hours, then of course the severity of this scenario will be significantly high than if there was only one cyber attack in a short time space. Then another driver is the peak usage. So if your customers use your online banking service between 12 and 2 in the afternoon, that's where the peak usage is. So if there was a cyber attack at that peak time, then the severity of that scenario is going to be much higher than if the cyber attack happens at 3 o'clock in the night, where not a lot of customers are using your service. Similarly, what type of cyber attacker also becomes a driver? So are they nation states? Are they international cyber gangs? Are they just amateurs who are just learning how to launch a cyber attack, and they're sort of using your systems to learn how to launch a cyber attack? Or are they advanced cyber criminals? So you identify all the different drivers which drive the severity of your scenarios, and then you start building the different scenarios, which we're calling that scenario analysis. So this is where you can say that now I have three scenarios I am creating in context of this, where the first scenario is large scale cyber attack by nation state actors, where they want to cause disruption to the IT system. So they're not interested in stealing money. They're not interested in stealing data. They just want to bring the IT systems of all the banks in a country down, because that's as part of a cyber war they may launch. So that becomes then one potential scenario you consider. And that scenario then is made up of the various drivers. So based on all the drivers you identified on the top, you're saying that, okay, which drivers are now relevant in that scenario. So you're saying that, okay, we are assuming in this case the attack will happen in peak time. It's a nation state. Only one attack is what we are assuming. And the primary intention is system availability, and they may use some distraction techniques to distract the IT team, and then the IT team maybe get distracted by some other virus issues, and that's when they will launch the attack, when the IT team has been distracted. And if I open that particular scenario, then you can capture the likelihood. So in this case, we're saying the likelihood is 1 to 5%. What is the level of threat? So this is quite a severe scenario. So the level of threat is quite high. And then you capture your drivers, and then you do your resilience assessment in context of this scenario. So this is where you say that if the scenario was to happen, now will you be able to stay within your impact tolerance? Yeah. So you again then do your preventative, you do your recovery assessment severity 1, recovery assessment severity 2, and in this case we can see that we will not be able to we will not be resilient in this case, because level 1 is the higher level where we will be resilient. So level 3 is that we will not be resilient in case of this scenario. Similarly, then you have other scenarios. In this case, another scenario is large-scale data theft attack by a nation state or international cyber gang. So they're interested in stealing data, and they go and update the data in the system because they want to create distrust. So they may, for example, divide all the numbers in the customer account by 2. And then customers may get confused. Oh, I had £10,000 and now I only have £5,000. So they may go and update the data to create distrust in external stakeholders or internal stakeholders then who utilize the information coming out from the systems supporting that service. And again, you have the different drivers, you set your likelihood range, and then you do your resilience assessment. And then the last scenario is multiple large-scale cyber attack on online banking system within a short time period. So that's where then you say that, so this is where there's not just one attack, but there are multiple attacks. You pick your driver, and then in your resilience assessment, you then capture that, okay, in this case, yeah, we'll definitely not be resilient if we face 2 or 3 significant cyber attack within 24 to 48 hours. So in real life, yeah, you'll be developing scenarios where, and these should be so those extreme and plausible scenarios, and regulator wants to see that you should be within the impact tolerance on many of the scenarios, not all the scenarios. And of course, there will be those extreme cases where you will not be able to meet those impact tolerances, and you will need to build those scenarios and demonstrate that you have done that level of thinking. So that sort of is the approach we recommend from defining your scenarios, that you create your scenario, identify the drivers, and then just create the different scenarios with the different permutation combination of those drivers. And then you look at your risks and incidents and third parties. So you look at all that information you have available, and then decide whether you will be resilient or not resilient in case of each of those scenarios. Okay, so that sort of is the details I wanted to share in terms of mapping the services to your business components. One recommendation, and of course, yeah, different methodologies will appear within the industry, so we'll keep an eye on that and sort of see how other stakeholders are thinking about that. And if you're sort of interested more in discussing the methodologies you've seen today, then happy to have a discussion on those. So something I want to just highlight, we had shared this in the last meeting. So the one big thing for which is new for all organizations is that you'll need to define the set of business services because that then becomes the foundation for everything we will do in operational resilience. And most organizations have not traditionally documented their business services in a structured way. So this sort of is a new activity coming out of the operational resilience regulation. And because it is new, it'll help if organizations can collaborate and to because larger organizations like Barclays and HSBC, they can probably go to the big four consultants, pay 100 to 100,000 pounds consulting and get them to build the business service library. But many financial services organizations may not have that luxury, and that's where sort of we want to facilitate that collaboration, where if you don't want to go and spend a lot of money on expensive consultants and you want to collaborate with your peers, then we want to create that channel. So we're setting up a business services working group where we will invite in financial services firms who want to collaborate, and then we can create a standard register of the business services which are relevant for the business lines which are represented on the working group, so that you can then brainstorm ideas with practitioners in other firms, and sort of take advantage of that. And then we will provide, if you were part of that working group, then of course you will be able to use that business services for your internal purposes. So it's a great way to sort of save a lot of money on consulting, and there is no fee for this. So this is just from a risk spotlight perspective. We want to provide that platform, and we've already received interest from after the session last week from 4 financial services organization. So we don't want this to be a big group. So we don't want 20, 25 financial organizations. So we're looking for between 6 to 10, 6 to 12 financial services organization. So if you are interested in collaborating on that, then please let me know, and I can send you the logistical details around that. Another element I wanted to highlight, which is also mentioned in the regulation, is that as part of resilience, you will need to monitor what is happening in the industry in terms of business disruptions and service disruptions, and then what are the emerging topics, in terms of resilience in different countries. So that's where I wanted to highlight the Risk Spotlight portal, which I had talked about earlier. That's our service where we are monitoring the emerging operational risk topics. So we monitor 126 operational risk as part of our service, where new content is added on a daily basis. So we look at forward-looking content. We also look at any loss incidents which have happened. And I've just highlighted here one of the screens where if you were interested in resilience, then you can look at the technology failures and damages category, which is where then you will be able to see all the news stories where things have gone wrong from a technology perspective in financial services organizations around the world. So you can then learn from their mistakes. And then the subscription is only available for £990, which is very cost effective compared to some of the other services which are available where individuals cannot subscribe, but you have to subscribe as an organization, and then the price point is quite high in that case. And if you have not trialed, then you can get access to all that content for free for 2 months. So you can go to that link and register for the trial, and then you'll be able to get that content. And if you're interested in resilience, then you can just look at that one risk category, technology failures and damages. Okay, and that's also included into the regulation. So it's it's a sales pitch, but it's also a requirement into the regulator that you will be required to demonstrate that you are monitoring those failures happening within the industry also. All right, so then let me touch the last topic before we close. So I want to touch this topic of decision making. So this was a slide I had shared in the first session where resilience is an outcome of making the right business decisions. Yeah, and I want to underline that because this is not explicitly mentioned in the regulation, but this is what the best practice talks about. So if you look at the resilience best practice, then they focus on business decision. The regulator is not focusing on that because that's sort of, you have to figure out what you want to do from a resilience perspective. But from, if you look at the resilience best practices, then the quality of decisions which are being made in different parts of your organization, that is going to be a very important driver on whether your organization achieves resilience in the medium to long term or not. So I want to focus on that aspect a little bit. So the reason we want to focus on decision making is because every key business decision which is made in an organization can either introduce new operational risk into your organization, or it can change the likelihood and impact of the operational risks you may already have in your organization. Yeah, so there is a very tight connection between decision making and change in the risk exposure. So if you only assess your risk once a year, that is good because you at least getting in at that point in time what your risk exposure looks like. But in real life, your risk exposure is changing every time a big decision is being made somewhere in the organization. And if you're not monitoring that, then you will be making decisions without considering the risk and then just waiting for surprises down the road. And this is why decision making is important, because whatever is the state of your business right now, that is due to all the decisions that were made in your organizations in the past and how those decisions turned out. So if you are in a good state today, that means good quality decisions were made in the past, and those decisions have turned out well. If you are in not so good state, then maybe poor quality decisions were made in the past, or those decisions were not executed in an effective way. So if we want to end up in a better future state in 12 months time, 2 years time, 4 years time, then we want to make sure that what decisions we make today, we focus on those, because those decisions we make and how they turn out is going to determine whether our organization will be resilient or not resilient in 2 years time, 4 years time, 10 years time. So in terms of the decision, so these are the three aspects you typically consider. So you have to consider the outcome of the decision. So typically when you're making a decision, you're trying to get some business outcome. So either in case of COVID-19 decision, so in this example, I'm using an organization is deciding when to bring employees back into the office. So that was a decision organization was making. That in that context, the outcome the organization is trying to get to is that we want to get to our revenue levels to the pre-crisis level, and we want to minimize the number of infections in our work environment when we come back into our work environment and during the transition period. So those are the two outcomes the organization is trying to address. And then every decision will have some planned input. So this can either be capital investment or it can be cost, that you need to spend some money in order to execute some actions needed for that decision. Or it can be intangible, where your senior executives may have to spend some time in order to make sure that decision goes well. So there are some investments you need to make. And then the third aspect is the risk. So that's where a risk, because the outcome of the decision is only going to unfold in the future. And whenever future is involved, there is uncertainty. And wherever there is uncertainty, there is risk. So that's why you want to consider the risk as part of every decision you're making, because that risk may either reduce the likelihood of you being able to achieve your outcome, or that risk may significantly increase the cost of implementing that particular decision, because you have to then put too many expensive controls in place to manage the risk related to that decision, which then increases the overall cost of that decision. And typically, in my experience, I've seen when organizations are making decision, they're definitely looking at the desired outcomes. They're looking at the planned input, and you may have also done this in terms of return on investment analysis, where you look at the return, you look at the investment, and in those analysis, risk sort of is not considered in as much detail as it should be. So it's sort of considered at a very superficial level or a very high level, and that sort of is what is missing, and what organizations can improve on in terms of making their decision, where a more detailed consideration of the risk is needed. And that also then is a very critical component in terms of resilience, because if we don't consider those risks, we will end up making some decisions which may compromise our resilience in the future. And that sort of is what I call high quality decision. So if you're making risk informed decision and you're considering risk as part of that decision making, then your organization is making high quality decision. If they're not, then I would call those decisions as low quality decisions. And those decisions are then happening everywhere in your organization. So right from the strategy level, they may be happening at the strategy execution level. They may be happening at your operational level. So what you'll need to do is you need to identify all the different places where those decisions are happening. So if you have a procurement team which is making a lot of decisions on outsourcing, then you want to go and find out what is their process for making that decision, and then ensure that the consideration of risk is embedded into that. Otherwise, they may end up making some outsourcing decision which may compromise the level of resilience for the organization in the future. And these are the three stages which typically go as part of every decision. So there is a process where you're making the decision. So where you consider different alternatives, and then you pick from one option or one alternative, and then you have to go and implement the decision. And once the decision is implemented, then the deliverables of those decisions then sort of become business as usual. And then you still have to manage risk as part of that. So risk, then you need to think about risk in all of those three stages. You don't want to think about the risk after you have implemented something or after you made the decision. And then when you start executing something, only then you think about the risks. So because we don't have adequate time, and this is a very detailed topic, so I had done this topic with an example of a COVID-19 recovery decision in a lot more detail. So if you're interested in that, then I just wanted to flag that we did a series last month on integrating the management of operational risk into core business processes, where we did 3 workshop sessions. And in the third session, we just focused on decision making on its own. So there is a recording of around 90 minutes where we talk about this concept a little bit more. And that's why I didn't want to duplicate all that today. So I wanted to give you just a starting point. But it's very important from a resilience perspective to think about improving the quality of the decisions, because if we don't do that, then everything will become a tick in the box exercise, and the whatever we do in operational resilience will be disconnected from what the business in the first line is doing from the day-to-day business perspective. And that sort of brings us to the end of the this particular session and the end of the series. So this is only 2 session because we wanted to at least start that conversation, put some ideas in the community. Because when I was attending training courses and conferences on operational resilience, there was a lot of high-level topics which were getting covered, and people were just rehashing what the regulatory documents are saying, and I was not seeing any practical examples saying, okay, what do I need to do? And that's why we sort of developed these practical tools and ideas, and we went and implemented those in form of the software we saw. And these workshops were our way of sort of sharing that. So at least we put some practical tools on table, and then you can sort of look at those, and if they work, great, adopt them. If they don't, then let us know, and then we are also continuously thinking on what new practices and methodologies we may have to create to achieve operational resilience. So if you're interested in if you're interested in organizing a workshop on any particular topic, then please send me an email. It can be related to operational resilience, or it can be related to operational risk in general, and then we'll be happy to organize workshops on those particular topic. So with that, I have covered everything I wanted to. Let me just check now on the Q&A side if there are any questions. Okay, so people are asking questions about the slides and the recording. So you will get the slides of the session, and you'll also get the copy of the recording. So you can sort of review that content and distribute and share it with your team if you're interested. So I will stay here to answer any questions. So if you have questions, you can stay. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining this session. You can disconnect if there's no more questions on your side. So thank you very much for your valuable time in coming for these 2 workshops.